You know, most of the time, when we picture the human brain, we just kind of imagine this single grayish mass sitting inside our skulls. But today, we're going to look at it completely differently. We're going to treat the brain like a fascinating biological landscape, and we're about to take a grand tour of its incredible geography. We'll literally be mapping your mind, moving from massive continents right down to specific, highly functional territories.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our itinerary for the tour. 1. The 3 major parts. 2. 2 halves, 1 brain. 3. Mapping the wrinkled terrain. And 4. The 4 major lobes.
All right, first stop, part 1, the 3 major parts.
So if we break it down, the brain is really composed of 3 main structural continents. First up is the cerebrum. This is the big one. When you visualize a brain with all that outer wrinkled cortex, you're mostly picturing the cerebrum. It's the major processing center, handling everything from language and emotions to voluntary movement. Now, sitting right underneath that, kind of tucked into the back of your head, is the cerebellum. Fun fact, in Latin, this actually translates to little brain. And if you look at it, it literally looks like 2 extra little cerebrums just hiding back there. Its job is all about keeping you upright and moving smoothly. It controls your balance, coordination, posture, and those fine motor skills. And finally, sitting right underneath the cerebrum is the brainstem. This serves as the actual physical bridge connecting your spinal cord to the rest of your body.
But the brainstem isn't just a physical bridge for information traveling back and forth. It's actually your ultimate survival center. It controls automatic functions like your breathing, your heartbeat, and your blood pressure. It handles all of those absolutely vital, life-sustaining tasks that you and I never even have to consciously think about.
Now imagine taking our brain map and slicing it perfectly in half to get a cross-section view. Suddenly, all these deep, hidden landmarks are revealed. We can see the thalamus, which basically acts as the grand relay center for information. Right nearby is the hypothalamus, which is tirelessly working to regulate your endocrine system, your hormones, and your sleep-wake cycle. Then we've got the pituitary gland, appropriately known as the master gland. And if we look really closely at the brainstem from this angle, we can actually make out its distinct bulges, the pons, and right below it, the medulla oblongata.
What's really interesting about how we map this is how scientists categorize these areas depending on how they look at them. We just talked about the structural parts, the cerebrum, cerebellum, and brainstem. But you might also hear these exact same areas referred to by their regional locations, mapping out the forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. The region containing the brainstem and cerebellum is called the hindbrain, and you'll often hear that thought of as our primal reptilian brain. The area right above that is the midbrain, sitting squarely on top of the brainstem. And that vast upper region, essentially the cerebrum, is called the forebrain. So it's basically just 2 different ways of charting the exact same incredible territory.
Moving right along to part 2, 2 halves, 1 brain.
Looking at things from above, it's immediately obvious that the brain is divided into 2 distinct halves, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. Now, I want to clear something up right away. You've probably heard someone say, "Oh, I'm left-brained, I'm very logical," or "I'm right-brained, I'm super creative." Well, the research points out that this is actually an entirely antiquated, outdated view of personality. While it is true that certain specific functions heavily favor one side, for example, language is primarily regulated in the left hemisphere, the reality is that these 2 hemispheres constantly work together as a synchronized team.
But physically, they really are separated. Running right down the exact middle of our brain map is a massive canyon. This is called the longitudinal fissure. In anatomy, the word fissure is typically used for these incredibly deep crevices. It acts as a massive geographical boundary, keeping the left and right halves physically apart from one another.
Which brings us to a really fascinating puzzle. If there's this massive canyon separating the left and right hemispheres, how on earth do they manage to act as that synchronized team we just talked about? So here's a bonus question for you to think about. What exactly connects both hemispheres together across that vast divide?
The answer is the corpus callosum. This is a thick, absolutely vital band of nerve fibers that bridges the gap, making high-speed communication between the 2 hemispheres possible. It's like the ultimate cross-continental cable. What's absolutely wild is that if this structure is surgically cut, which is sometimes done for medical reasons, that communication is severed, resulting in what we call split brain patients. The 2 halves literally stop talking to each other. Crazy, right?
All right, part 3, mapping the wrinkled terrain.
And this brilliantly illustrates one of nature's greatest biological hacks. I mean, why is the human brain so incredibly wrinkled? The answer comes down to simple geometry and real estate.
To get smarter, our brains needed more processing power, and that meant needing more surface area. But we can't exactly walk around with giant oversized skulls, so the brain elegantly folded in on itself, wrinkling and crumpling to pack an immense amount of surface area into a relatively small, compact space.
Because scientists absolutely love to map things, every single one of those folds has a proper name. Those little crevices or deep valleys that sink inward are called sulci, or a sulcus if you're just talking about one. You can think of a sulcus just like a deep valley or a trench on a topographical map.
But you can't have a valley without a hill, right? The little bumps or ridges of brain tissue that rise up right next to those valleys are called gyri, or a gyrus for just one. Together, the sulcus and the gyrus create the distinct peaks and valleys of our brain's landscape. And I want to emphasize, these aren't just random wrinkles. These specific grooves and ridges matter immensely because they form the absolutely crucial boundaries between different functional regions of the brain.
Which brings us to our final stop, Part 4, the 4 major lobes.
Now let's map out these specific functional territories. Let's start by looking for a very specific, highly important valley that runs right across the top of the brain. This is the central sulcus. The central sulcus is incredibly important because it acts as the border wall dividing two massive functional continents: the frontal lobe right in the front and the parietal lobe sitting directly behind it.
Now let's look at the two hills sitting right on either side of that central sulcus boundary. The gyrus sitting right in front of the central sulcus is the primary motor gyrus. Its job is purely output, sending commands down your spinal cord to your muscles to tell you to move. Now, right behind the central sulcus is the primary somatosensory cortex. Its job is purely input, receiving sensory information from your body, like noticing if something you're touching is hot, cold, spiky, or smooth. So think about that. This one single valley physically separates the part of your brain that makes you move from the part of your brain that lets you feel. Pretty amazing.
Let's move on and see how this builds our map even further. We have another major boundary called the lateral sulcus. This is a remarkably deep crevice on the side of the brain. If you were holding a physical brain model, this sulcus creates a shape that looks exactly like a thumb. This thumb is the temporal lobe, and the lateral sulcus is the deep groove that completely divides this temporal lobe from the frontal and parietal lobes sitting just above it. On the outside, the temporal lobe primarily processes audio information from your ears. But what is truly amazing is what lies beneath the surface. If you were to literally peel apart the temporal lobe and look deep inside this territory, you'd find the hidden hardware that makes you who you are. The hippocampus, which is absolutely vital for processing your memories, and the amygdala, which sits deep inside and processes your emotions. So, let's bring everything we've mapped out together right here. We have the frontal lobe in the front, handling all our higher-level cognitive processes, things like decision-making, problem-solving, and impulse control. Then the parietal lobe up top and in the middle, processing the sensory information we feel. The temporal lobe on the sides, our thumb shape, handling hearing, memory, and emotion. And finally, sitting all the way in the back, right about the cerebellum, is the occipital lobe. Even though it's all the way in the back of your head, this lobe is entirely dedicated to taking in and processing visual information from your eyes, helping you actually see the world around you.
And that concludes our grand tour. We've mapped the massive structural continents, bridged the great divide of the hemispheres, and explored the intricate peaks and valleys of the cortex. But I really want to leave you with this thought. If every physical wrinkle, bump, and valley we just looked at holds the literal secrets to how you move, think, and feel, what undiscovered territories are still hiding right now within the map of your own mind?